As many are aware, the Hale-Bopp comet played a major role in the mass suicides of Heaven's Gate that took place in 1997. But what exactly that role was is a matter of some dispute. And so this has become one of the most common questions people ask about Heaven's Gate. What was the significance of the Hale-Bopp comet? Well, to begin with, the Hale-Bopp comet is a comet that passes near the Earth every few thousand years or so. It was first discovered in the summer of 1995 on the same day by two separate people, Hale and Thomas Bopp. They discovered the comet months before it was visible to the naked eye. But throughout 1996, as the comet got closer to the Earth, it became one of the earliest examples of a viral phenomenon on the internet. It was also starting to lend itself to conspiracy theories and end times predictions. Now, within the discourse around Heaven's Gate, the name that typically comes up most often in association with those kinds of conspiracy theories and apocalyptic vibes surrounding the Hale-Bopp comet is Art Bell. Art Bell was a radio host. He hosted a program called Coast to Coast AM. He would have people come on and talk about ghost stories, the paranormal, conspiracy theories. And at some point in late 1996, he had on someone named Chuck Schramek, who was a somewhat controversial astronomer, who claimed to have photographed the comet and shown that it had what he described as a companion, the implication being that this companion was a UFO. Heaven's Gate was not the only group that was attributing some sort of religious significance to this comet, but it is widely believed that Heaven's Gate listened to Art Bell's radio program, heard that episode with Chuck Schramek, and latched onto this idea. So the reason Art Bell even comes up in the conversation around Heaven's Gate is largely because of a statement made by Rio D'Angelo. He was one of the last people, if not the last person, to leave Heaven's Gate just a couple months before the mass suicides. Rio apparently said that one of the members of Heaven's Gate, a guy named Michael Howard Carrier, who was known in the group as Tall Odie because he was the tallest, that he had been a listener of Art Bell or had told the group that he heard this episode with Chuck Schramek, and that supposedly he was the one that brought the idea of the Hale-Bopp comet to the group. We don't know for sure if that's what happened. We don't know with a lot of certainty what exactly Heaven's Gate's relationship was to these other conspiracy theories, to these other end times predictions. But we do know that they were aware of them. Now, here's where it gets tricky. Heaven's Gate clearly thought that the Hale-Bopp comet was a sign of something, but they don't actually say a whole lot about what exactly they thought that meant. And what little they did say about it is quite confusing. One of the first things a person is greeted with when they visit the Heaven's Gate website is the following sentence: whether or not Hale-Bopp has a quote-unquote companion is irrelevant to us. They explain that they believe it is the sign that their time on this planet has come to an end, and it is time for them to graduate on to the next level, to return to the next level, and to be reunited with T, Bonnie Nettles, who had passed away around 12 years earlier. They committed suicide right around the time when this comet was at its most visible, which was in late March, early April of 1997. But then they say that it doesn't matter whether or not it has a companion. So a lot of people assume that Heaven's Gate thought that the comet either was a UFO or that a UFO was hiding behind the comet. We actually don't know if that's what they thought. This is a plausible interpretation to have. I don't want to suggest otherwise, but we actually don't know for sure if that's what they believed. And case in point, they say it doesn't matter to them whether it has a companion or not. So they seem to think that that was not really that important. But so then what was the significance? What What made them think that this comet was a sign of anything? Well, in many ways, I think this is always going to be sort of an open question whenever we're asking why a particular religion imbues some particular object with some particular meaning. A lot of it, I think, is ultimately arbitrary, or it is something that is, a combination of so many different factors, some of which we might be able to guess at, some of which we might have no access to at all. Because remember, we don't have a lot of access to the specific conversations of them, like discussing the Hale-Bopp comet and what it means. They didn't write a lot about it. What we do know is that they were already planning a mass suicide for some time before the comet even became a topic of conversation anywhere. Throughout 1996, the students of Heaven's Gate were writing essays where they explain basically their reasons for leaving. So the implication is that they are planning to leave at some point in the near future, and they're explaining why they're about to do that. And this was well before any discussion of the Hale-Bopp comet was even a thing. They had already gotten to a point as a group where the possibility of ending their own lives was starting to be taken very seriously. So it wasn't so much that the comet's appearance made them think, oh my gosh, we should probably end our lives. No, they were already planning to do that. Another thing to keep in mind is that the comet appeared, or was going to be most visible, right around Easter, which has connotations of, death and then rebirth into eternal life. And given the fact that Heaven's Gate was very obviously influenced by Christianity, they might have seen this as sort of, not a coincidence, but rather something of great significance, that the comet was predicted to be at its most visible right around the time of Easter. Heaven's Gate also, throughout their history, had engaged in a practice that they called Night Watch. This was actually like a chore that some members in the group would be assigned to do. They would stay up all night long looking up at the stars and taking note of any abnormalities that they observed, anything that they thought was interesting or unusual, because they were always on the lookout for the UFO. They had been talking about a UFO coming to extract them from the planet since day one of their movement. So the fact that they interpreted an astronomical phenomenon as a sign for them should not surprise us. Why this particular phenomenon, we can only speculate. No one who currently believes in Heaven's Gate, as far as I'm aware, is waiting for the comet to reappear. They don't joyously await for its next appearance, and if they are, they have quite a long time to do that, because it's not supposed to appear until the year 4000 something. So got a couple millennia to go. They do believe that the Next Level will send another representative, like they did with Tian-Do, like they believe they did with Jesus, and so on, that will happen again, and possibly within the next few thousand years or so, but they don't really know. They don't really seem to have decided on the specifics of that issue. But at least as far as I'm aware, as far as I can tell, based on statements that they have said in public, they don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about the Hale-Bopp comet. But to suggest that the Hale-Bopp comet is not at all significant to Heaven's Gate, as some contemporary believers have sort of implied, I think that is also a mistake. So there's a couple of extremes we want to avoid. Overstating the significance of the comet on the one hand, and understating the significance on the other. We don't want to make either of those mistakes when we're doing this kind of research. The last thing I would point out is that if we're confused by the statements made by Heaven's Gate, whether from the past or the present, consider that this may be because they themselves were or are somewhat confused. I don't think this is really that controversial to suggest. I think there is ample evidence that Heaven's Gate, despite creating what, in my opinion, is a very rich and surprisingly complicated belief system, I do not think they actually fully understood all of the nooks and crannies of their own logic. I think that there are many junctures in the Heaven's Gate belief system where you see the members sort of embrace a kind of agnosticism. There is a sort of bar beyond which they don't really speculate any further. There are a lot of things that they claim not to be fully certain of. And so it shouldn't really surprise us that they may have also been somewhat ambivalent on the specific meaning of the comet. And remember, a lot of the things that motivated Heaven's Gate were basically kind of these intuition sort of things. They felt like the comet meant something, so it did. They had been working very hard for a very long time on overcoming their humanness, and for some time even prior to the discussion of the Hale-Bopp comet at all, they were already starting to kind of think like, we're kind of ready to go. We kind of feel like we've done all that we can do on Earth, and that it's time for us to move on to the next phase of our development. So there is the possibility that if the comet didn't show up and didn't get interpreted as a sign by Heaven's Gate, maybe something else would have. So definitely feel free to leave any other theories or any other insights that you've come across or that you've come up with yourself in the comments below, and keep this discussion on this interesting topic going. Thanks.